cut my teeth on the back of an old church pew. I learned to walk in the ways of light and truth, and I was told not to speak till I was spoken to. I heard it preach what I should and I should not do, and the choir sang, tried to be a good boy, but I ain't a boy no more. I've seen some things that a man just can't ignore, and this world's gonna see what I'm standing for. I've kept my peace, but I can't hold my tongue anymore. You can't buy my silence, you can't steal my voice, you can't keep me quiet. I will break the noise. Try to beat me down, tell me to shut my mouth, but there's a time to speak, and the time is now. The squeaky wheel is always getting grease. Well, I've been sitting still, parked here on the side of the street, always tiptoeing, trying not to wake the beast. Oh, but here I come.
Professor Paul.
Thank you.
And I have with me Professor Martin Paul, a leading expert in electromagnetic radiation. And I also have with me Raji Nevin, Dr. Paul.
Hi, Dr. Paul. How are you?
I'm fine, thanks. How are you doing?
We're
Good.
both doing good. We're so glad you can make it and have you in our community via phone.
Great. hmm
Now, can you, would you like to present or tell us what your thoughts are on 5G, on Wi-Fi, on autism,
Health effects.
health effects, and whatever you want to, however you want to lay it all out.
Okay, I'll do that. And let me just first of all thank your listeners for being here. I think we're all crisis fatigued, and I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but we've got a crisis which, in my judgment, is worse than any of the others, and that's the way EMFs impact our health. So let me just say, give you a little insight into how I got involved in this. I worked in environmental medicine issues, mainly how chemicals work in the body, before I got involved with EMF issues. So I have a good general background, and I got my bachelor's degree in physics and my PhD in biochemistry and genetics, both from top institutions, and I basically stumbled on how EMFs work in the body based on some information that had been published in the literature starting in the 1970s, and quite a number of other papers more recent that told us how these things work. So, and it turns out that there are a whole series of different health impacts that have been extensively documented, and all of them can be explained through the mechanism of action that I found. So let's start and talk about some of these. And let me just say one other thing. I've published now 8 papers, and each of them having, I think, important implications about all of this. Okay, so one of the things that I've done in addition to the 8 papers that I've published is I've written up a 90-page document about what a big international crisis this is for us, both in the U.S. and in the European Union and in various other parts of the world, and how various kinds of electromagnetic fields produce health effects, and then what the consequences of 5G are that how they work, and why I think 5G situation is really quite dire. Okay, so let's start with some of the very well documented effects of these EMFs, and there are large numbers of reviews, there's published reviews, that each show that there's a body of evidence for EMFs causing one or more effects in the body. And those include various kinds of neurological effects and neuropsychiatric effects. So they have large effects on our brains and, in fact, on our entire nervous systems. And the nervous system appears to be the most sensitive organ in the body to the EMFs. Then, in addition to this, we have a whole series of reproductive effects. So we get changes in the testis and in the ovaries. We get lowered numbers of sperm. So we have lowered sperm count, lowered sperm quality. We also have lowered levels of the eggs. In animals, this hasn't been studied in humans, but there do appear to be effects on females in humans. You also get increases in spontaneous abortion. You get decreases in each of the three sex hormones, estrogen, progesterone, testosterone. And you also get lowered libido. So the whole slew of things affecting reproduction. Now, these two areas that I've just talked about are both, as best we can determine, very, very far along in terms of their impacts on people, not only in the U.S. but in essentially every other technologically advanced country on Earth. So, for example, the sperm count in every technologically advanced country on Earth has dropped by over 50% from what we consider normal. So there's already been a huge impact. Now, you don't know for certain that this is caused by the EMFs, but that's the obvious thing, because we know that the EMFs do this, and we know that, we're exposed all over these in these technologically advanced countries to EMFs, to very substantial levels, which produce these reproductive effects and are known to produce these reproductive effects. So, that's the obvious interpretation. And going along with that, reproduction in every single technologically advanced country on Earth, with one single exception, has dropped well below replacement level. So we're looking at drops in reproduction that have already occurred. There was a fascinating animal study that was published over 20 years ago now, where EMFs, well within the levels that are permitted by our safety guidelines, in mice, caused an immediate drop in reproduction, so lowered levels of reproduction. In mice, gestation period is about 30 days, so it goes very quickly. And what was found was that at one level of exposure, you got a considerable drop in reproduction in the first litter, in the second litter, and the third litter essentially was nothing. Reproduction drops to zero. At a somewhat lower level exposure, you get basically the same situation, except it takes twice as long. And what was also found was that if you stopped exposing, so that the possible reproduction in the last litter was without any exposure, you see little, if any, recovery. So the effects seem to be irreversible. So that alone is enough. These things alone are enough to cause extinction.
Wait, could you say that again? I thought I heard you say the word extinction.
That's exactly what I said. I said extinction. I mean, look, if our reproduction drops to zero, and which is what happens in the animals, and we're already far along in this process. What it means is that it's quite possible that within a relatively short time period, that reproduction could go essentially to zero, in which case every single technologically advanced country on Earth will be without a future.
When you say a short time period, can you give an estimate of that?
Well, yeah, I can give an estimate. Generally, things in rodents go about 15 times faster than they go in humans. When you look at various kinds of environmental effects, they seem to work much more rapidly in rodents, and that makes sense because the rodents have higher metabolic rates and much shorter lifespans. Based on the rodents, basically, as I said before, we were talking about drops in reproduction going to zero in 3 to 5 months, or let's say 3 to 6 months. And if you say, so if that goes in humans, you have a similar thing. I'd estimate, you're talking about something like 5 years.
Wow.
I mean, I know, that's incredible, isn't it?
Yes.
Now, that is a best guess, okay? I can't say for certain it's going to be that length of time.
Right.
And I think the other thing that I can say is that, in the rodent studies, each of the two groups of rodents was exposed to a particular level of exposure and type of exposure. And so they were exposed to much more homogeneous exposures than we are. We have more variation. On the other hand, when you have a situation where sperm counts have dropped by over 50%, and yet, we still have, we've had some drops in fertility, but it hasn't been, I mean, most couples are able to have at least some children at this point. What that tells you is that almost all of us are impacted already. So yes, we were exposed to somewhat different levels, but and when you think about what things have been shown to have reproductive effects, what are they? Well, we know that Wi-Fi has reproductive effects. How many of us are in Wi-Fi fields, during the day? Yeah. We know that people who live within about 300 meters, about 1,000 feet of cell phone towers, there are effects. What about, now the effects that have been looked at with cell phones are mostly other kinds of effects, but there are effects on people, living within 1,000 feet of cell phone towers, and over 30% of us live within 1,000 feet of cell phone towers. And many of the rest of us, work within that distance, or we have schools well within that distance, and so forth. So,
And would I be correct in saying then that the introduction of 5G infrastructure into any community is only going to hasten what you just described?
I think 5G is going to be a total disaster, and I will tell you why later on as we go into this. But yes, I think 5G will be extremely serious. Having said that, the crucial thing I think that is clear, absolutely clear about 5G, is that that the plan that has already been approved by the Congress is to put out tens of millions of 5G antennae, so that basically it'll be almost impossible to avoid them, avoid the radiation from them, and without even one single biological safety test.
Wow.
And I'll explain exactly what I mean by that later on. But that's the situation with 5G, which, in my judgment, is sheer insanity. But let's go on. Let's go back to the effects of the other EMFs, because I think there we have much more evidence. With 5G, we have no evidence. We do have some studies of the frequency of 5G, but nothing with the very high level of pulsation with 5G will have, and that's a very critical factor here, and I'll tell you why as we discuss these things. Okay, so let's now I want to go back before finishing up on the neurological neuropsychiatric effects. Among those effects that have been documented are that one has sleep disturbance, insomnia, fatigue and tiredness, headaches. You get depression and depressive symptoms. You have lack of concentration, and some of these I'm putting in groups here because they're clearly related. Lack of concentration, attention, cognitive dysfunction. We have dizziness and vertigo. We have memory changes, namely our memories don't work very well. We have restlessness, tension, anxiety, stress, agitation, and irritability. Now, all those things, there's extensive evidence from many studies showing that EMFs cause them, and many types of microwave frequency EMFs cause them. So it's not just one thing causes them and not others. So you get similar effects based on on the information we have from cell phone usage and from cell phone towers, from the antennae. You get similar effects from Wi-Fi. You get similar effects from smart meters, and there is evidence from other kinds of EMFs as well, from radar and various other types of EMF exposures. So lots of things cause these things. And those are the things, I think, the things that I just discussed are the things that almost everybody complains about nowadays. And I think we all know that. And that's not only true in the U.S., it's true throughout the technologically advanced countries on Earth. So I think that it is, reasonable to think that the neurological / neuropsychiatric effects are very widespread already. And
did you say widespread neuropsychiatric?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
One thing I want to add, and you can corroborate, is in the declassified military documents I looked at, the old ones, it stated the most profound effects from microwave radiation that the military discovered were behavioral effects. Okay.
I didn't know that, but I'm not at all surprised. I think that's what all the other literature shows. And there are occupational exposure studies that were done back mostly in the 1970s, when there were very few other exposures that showed, again, a similar pattern. And what's also important is that those studies also showed that the effects tended to be cumulative, and at least in some cases became irreversible as they become more severe. So this pattern of cumulative. So when I talked about the animal studies on reproduction, those clearly show that the effects are cumulative. because you get more exposure to the same EMFs, just longer time periods of of these same exposures. Things become more severe, and then they become irreversible as they become more severe. And the same thing seems to be true with the neurological and neuropsychiatric effects. And so now, so immediately you've got two things here that are obviously extremely serious. The one, I discussed already the issue of what happens if our reproduction essentially drops to zero and we have no future. But the other question, which is equally or perhaps even more serious, is what happens when our collective brain function deteriorates to the point where the society just becomes completely dysfunctional. Some people have said to me, well, it looks like we're pretty far along on that process already. So these are really truly extraordinary, and I want to say with both the reproductive effects and the neurological effects, there are lots and lots of animal studies where you do good experimental studies, and there is no question that EMF exposures, well within our safety guidelines, produce each of these effects in experimental animals. So we don't just have the studies in humans; we also have animal studies, and that's important.
And what about, as you say, the neurological studies, the neurological effects? What about autism connection? I mean, that's an epidemic. Am I right?
Yes. Okay, so let's talk. Let me go through these 8 things that are extremely well documented, and then we can come back to autism and some of the other things.
Good.
Would that be
Good.
okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So what else do we have? We have, and these are all, as I said, these are all extensively documented. There are many reviews on each of these. There is also increases in what's called apoptosis, which is programmed cell death. That's very important, both in terms of producing the reproductive effects and also in producing neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and ALS and Parkinson's disease. So, and there is, I think, there is substantial evidence that very early onset Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, which we are seeing now. They're still quite rare, but we are seeing them in people age 30 coming down with Alzheimer's disease. That this sort of response, again, in animal models, can be produced by EMF exposures. So, and EMF exposure is well within our safety guidelines. So, the safety guidelines, as you've already seen, are complete nonsense. I mean, they have no connection with the actual biology, and there are lots of studies which have shown effects at levels on a thousandth or less of what our safety guidelines claim are safe. So we have totally crazy stuff.
Can I say something about the safety guidelines?
I'm sorry?
Can I say something about the safety guidelines?
Sure,
because
go ahead.
You're one of the first people that I've heard called them guidelines. Most people say regulations and standards, and people talk about them as if they're laws, and they're not. And they were just set by the FCC, and so whenever you try and challenge that, anywhere you go within the industry, they always go right back to the FCC about these guidelines. They're only guidelines, and yet they seem to have so much power.
Well, I think what's clear is that, first of all, these guidelines, and the FCC, by the way, twice in recent years has increased the allowable exposures.
Really?
Despite the fact that all the evidence is pointing that we should vastly decrease them.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and they don't, the FCC guidelines are just, they're just nonsense. They have
Right.
nothing. And they give. You know, if you read their website, they give you zero evidence on anything that they say there.
Mm-hmm.
They give you no evidence whatsoever, and I have discussed that in a fair amount of detail in my 90-page document that I'm kind of going through right now. So yeah, it's this whole thing is anyway. It's the original safety guidelines were based on the notion that the only thing that the EMFs can do is to heat things.
Right.
And therefore that if there's a minimal amount of heating, then you don't have to worry about it. Well, in fact, we know that the main mechanism of action, it has nothing to do with heating, and I'll tell you what it is in a bit. And we also know that that you get effects at levels that are a tiny fraction of what the safety guidelines allow. So so these claims are just nonsense. I mean, they're simply wrong, and we've known they were wrong for over 40 years based on the published evidence. But now we know what the mechanism is, and so we know why they're wrong, and I'll talk about that in a bit. Okay, so what else do we have? We have high levels of oxidative stress and free radical damage that occur following EMF exposures. Again, well within our safety guidelines, and so so that occurs, and that's been found in at least 200 studies that have been published, and there are also widespread endocrine, that is hormonal effects. And in the endocrine effects, in some cases you get increases in hormone action, in some cases you get decreases. And there are quite a number of situations where you can get either increases or decreases in activity of the same hormone, depending on the conditions. So you don't always get effects in the same direction. It depends on conditions, and there are often differences between acute exposures, that is short-term exposures, and long-term exposures. So so there's a complex issue. I think again that we know how this thing works, how the endocrine effects can be produced, and I've discussed that. We also have increases in intracellular calcium, that is the calcium levels within the cells of our bodies, and you also get increases in calcium signaling, which is very important. And I will tell you that most of the effects are produced through this excessive calcium in the cell. Most of the other things that I'm going to talk about, come from that. So that seems to be the direct primary effect that we have to consider. There are 35 reviews on cancer causation. So there's extensive evidence on cancer, and there are I can't remember how many now. There's something like 18 reviews on DNA effects, which I haven't talked about. So the cellular DNA, the DNA of our cells, is attacked by these microwave and lower frequency EMFs. And let me just say, the mechanism appears to be through the free radicals that I mentioned before. Okay, so the free radicals then attack the DNA of our cells, and so the free radicals go up after exposure, and then they attack the DNA. And you get three different types of DNA damage, and each of them are important. You get single-stranded breaks in the cellular DNA. You get double-stranded breaks in the cellular DNA, and you also get oxidized bases in the cellular DNA. All these things can produce important mutations that can be then cause young babies to carry mutations of the most important types that we know about from human genetics. And they also can cause cancer, of course. So the DNA effects are quite serious. And
and cancer is usually on the rise. It seems like every other person you talk to has cancer.
Yeah, we are seeing increases. And let me just say, with regard to the cancer.
Hold that thought, Dr. Paul. We got to do station identification.
Okay.
And you're listening to WIOF-LP Woodstock 104, and this is the Woodstock Truth Squad with Steve Romine and Dr. Martin Paul on the phone.
Okay, Dr. Paul.
Okay. So, cancer generally has a long latency period. So, it's relatively rare that you start seeing cancers with less than 10 years of exposure. Although, interestingly, people who live near cell phone towers, actually, there's studies that have reported cancer increases in much shorter time periods, which suggests that cell phone tower radiation is very dangerous. And I think generally with regard to cell phone usage, the people who start, you see cancer, after about 10 years of cell phone usage and relatively little before that. But, that doesn't mean that the cancer you're going to see after 20, 30 years may not be much, much higher than what we're already seeing in something like 10 years. Because the latencies can be much longer than that, and probably are in these cases.
Don't you think the latency is getting shorter, though, with everyone holding these smartphones up against their head all the time?
Well, that may be true, too, yes. And I think, I just published a paper not on, whether EMFs cause cancer, but how they can cause cancer. Mm-hmm. And in that paper, I showed that the main mechanism of action, which is activation of what are called voltage-gated calcium channels,
right, and
these then produce excessive calcium in the cell when they're activated, and that basically that pathway can act in 15 different ways to cause cancer. And 3 of them were the DNA effects that I talked about before. But there are many others, and they include what are called tumor promotion and tumor progression. And when those things are stimulated, then you also have then a decrease in the latency. So I think that it's highly likely, in fact, that the latency is decreased as well.
Can you talk about the VGCCs a little more and explain
what
it is?
I haven't talked about them at all, really. Okay, so how do these EMFs work? That's been a key issue. And let me just say a couple of things about this before I talk about that. The industry has been claiming that there could not be a biophysical mechanism for these low-intensity EMFs to produce biological effects. Okay, and we've known that they were wrong about that, but we didn't know why they were wrong. And let me just say, I got my bachelor's in physics, so I feel very comfortable dealing with the physics aspects of this, which turn out to be quite important. So what are voltage-gated calcium channels? And let me just say, I abbreviate these VGCCs, just so, I'm not going to be talking about them, as voltage-gated calcium channels, which will take a while. So what happens is when these are activated, they open up a channel and they allow huge amounts of calcium to flow into the cell. And it's the excess calcium in the cell which is responsible for most, if not all, of the biological effects. And the way in which these VGCCs are controlled is through a structure which is called the voltage sensor. Okay, so this is a structure in this complex protein that's in the plasma membrane, in the membrane that surrounds our cells. And when the voltage sensor is pushed on by electrical changes, it then opens up the channel and it allows the calcium to flow into the cell. Now, normally calcium's kept very, very low in the cell. We've got something like 10,000 times as much calcium outside our cells than inside. And so when these channels open up, you can get a huge amount of calcium flowing into the cell. You get about 1 million ions flowing in per second that the channel is open. So if you keep opening these channels, and you know a lot of channels in a single cell, you can have a lot of calcium flowing in, and that, it turns out, can cause all kinds of problems. So, so normally what happens is that these things are just activated for very short time periods, and they close, and then the calcium is pumped out, so that we get only short transients of calcium coming in to regulate some things. But what's happening with the EMS is that we're getting much, much more calcium flowing in, and that's what's causing the problems. So, and let me just say, when you look at the structure of this voltage sensor that controls it, you can see why the voltage sensor is so incredibly sensitive to these weak electrical forces that are produced by the EMS. It turns out that the structure of the voltage sensor, from the physics of it, from the physics of the structure, predicts that the forces on the voltage sensor are going to be something like 7.2 million times stronger than the forces on singly electrically charged groups that are in the watery parts of the cell, and which is, where most of those charged groups are. And so because of that, and because heating is produced predominantly by the forces on these electrically charged groups in the watery parts of the cell, this means that the actual mechanism, namely the voltage sensor, that's important, being 7.2 million times more sensitive, then that means that our safety guidelines are probably off by something like a factor of 7.2 million. So we're being exposed to much, much higher levels than we should be exposed to, and that's so we're really in a totally insane situation. Now, the fact that a lot of these things develop slowly over time and we don't notice them often means that we're less aware of what's going on, and but when you have things like the neuropsychiatric effects, and when you have things like the reproductive effects that not only develop slowly over time but become much more, but because the cumulative effects become much more severe with time and become irreversible with time, we are in a very, very difficult situation, and I think that should be absolutely clear to anyone who's looking at this. Okay. So
I have a question for you real quick.
Yeah.
And with those effects you just mentioned, what about the effect of becoming electrosensitive, if that's even the right term to use? But if the population, a big part of the population, becomes electrosensitive, we got a huge problem in this world of electronics.
Yeah, and that's another thing that's going on. I think the what's been called, and some people call this microwave syndrome, and that was the term that was used in the Soviet Union, and they did a lot of important experiments on EMF effects, and also important studies in humans on EMF effects, and So yeah, it is very serious. And let me just say, I have a part in my document where I consider how autism and how ADHD can be generated by these, by the EMFs, and so the evidence that we have is that the most crucial exposures involved in producing ADHD and autism occur in the what's called the perinatal period, the period before birth, sort of the last third or so of gestation, and that's a period when there's a lot of formation of the synapses in the brain, and that I think is a crucial thing. And then also after birth, particularly the first 6 months or so after birth, which again is very important in terms of the formation of the synapses in the developing brain. It turns out that there are 4 distinct mechanisms that are known to regulate the formation of the synapses. So the synapses are the ways in which neurons sort of talk to each other, how they interact with each other. And so they are essential. It's essential to form, the proper synapses and not form improper ones in order to get normal function for the brain. And so it turns out that these 4 mechanisms which regulate the formation of the synapses are all calcium-dependent mechanisms. So that means that when you've got excessive calcium in those neurons produced by the EMFs, it really disrupts the formation of the synapses, the proper formation of the synapses, and so you end up with ADHD, and you end up with autism, and that causes obviously huge amounts of problems. So so we have all kinds of effects which are what are called existential threats that threaten our very existence. And so we have not only the neurological, neuropsychiatric effects, the reproductive effects, we have the DNA effects, which easily impact our can impact our existence by producing lots and lots of mutations, and obviously autism and ADHD and the related neurological dysfunction is another thing that can easily be an existential threat. We know that just one autistic child is sufficient to have major impacts on a family. Sure. And it's quite possible with increases in exposure, such as from 5G, that instead of having something like 1 in 40 autism births in the U.S., it could go up to almost anything. It could go up to, 1 in 5, 1 in 2, maybe one and 1.5. I mean,
this is
we
huge.
have no idea what it can go up to.
This is huge. Am I correct? This is a huge problem that they're not talking about.
They're not talking about it. We're doing everything we can to make it much, 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 much worse. Mm-hmm. And the FCC is leading the charge on this. Mm-hmm. It's insane, absolutely insane.
Can you talk about when you were saying interrupting the synapses, and that's what leads to the autism and the ADD? Can you talk about what that is exactly? Like, is it doing something to the nervous system, or what's causing it?
So the nervous system, in order to function, it functions, almost entirely through the synapses, through the ways in which one neuron, interacts with another. So, what's been shown in the autism patients, and also in animal models of autism, is that the connectivity of the brain is aberrant, and in general you have low connectivity over long distances, and so so that's exactly what the synapses are doing. It's connecting things up. So the findings in autism, they make sense in terms of the way we know that the synaptic formation occurs. And now let me just say, I don't think that we have bulletproof evidence that this is the way autism is occurring. In my judgment, it's highly probable that it's correct. But that's something, so reasonable people can differ from. But what I don't think reasonable people can differ from is the fact that we are taking incredible risks, absolutely incredible risks, with our reproduction, with our neurological, neuropsychiatric function, and with the DNA of our cells. And when you look at what's going on with the VGCC activation, the excessive calcium in the cell, and what it does from a biologist standpoint, it's almost impossible to think of anything that's worse other than just instantaneous death. And why do I say that? Well, I say that because we know these things impact the nervous system in many cases massively. We know they influence the hormone systems. Well, those are the two systems that sort of make us multicellular organisms, where we have one part of the body communicating with another part, right? So in terms of being anything other than some single-celled creature in the primeval ooze, these are very, very important things that are being impacted, right? And then you have the fact that you get excessive calcium in the cell. Calcium signaling is probably the most important intracellular signaling system in our bodies.
Wow.
And then you got the attacks on the DNA, our genetic material. The thing that makes us different from any other species on Earth is it's in the DNA. So it's just crazy. It's crazy what we're doing. It really is.
Professor Paul, I read some of your presentation on autism, and with the slides, and I saw where you said they actually did do animal studies, exposing the animals to microwave, and the synapses in the autopsies showed that their synapses were stunted.
Yeah, and actually, some of those studies were done in adults even, which are much less sensitive than the developing, the developing fetus and the very young individuals. You get massive effects on the synapses in animals, and that's true, absolutely true, yes. And they're also there's better data on ADHD in animals. So when you there have been studies published where you get late prenatal exposures to the EMFs, and you find that they produce things in mice and in rats that are very similar to ADHD. You also get symptoms that are similar to autism, but there it's at least somewhat less obvious, the connection. So, so there have been studies of those sorts that have been published. Let me just say there have also been studies done on two other effects, and I want to mention at least briefly. One has to do with the I mentioned before the Alzheimer's and other dementias. There were two studies done on rats, where they showed that short EMF pulses that are at least superficially similar to what we get from our smart meters. When you gave a series of these short pulses to young rats, and then you stop exposing them, and then you look at them as the equivalent of middle-aged rats, and what do you find? You find they've got the kind of behavioral things that you see with Alzheimer's disease. And what you also find is you have high levels of both oxidative stress and the amyloid beta protein in the brains of these rats. And both of those changes then are characteristic of what you see in Alzheimer's disease in humans. So there's a lot of there's a lot of very interesting data on these things, and again, I don't know that I can tell you that that EMFs are the major, are at least developing into the major cause of these very early onset dementias. We do know we are starting to get these very early onset dementias, people age 30 coming down with Alzheimer's disease, and so it's very plausible that the EMFs are causing them. I can't tell you for certain that that's the cause, but we really don't have any other reasonable hypothesis that explains what's going on. And as I said before, we have evidence in animals that you can get these effects from EMF exposures. Now, okay.
I have a question about the pulsing, because I was curious about that when I was listening to you talk about it before. Pulsing, does the pulsing, because I always tell people pulsing is the key word. Mm-hmm. Is that something that causes, or at least in part causes, the extra calcium to enter the cell?
It seems to make it more. It seems to make it more efficient. It seems to make it more efficient. The VGCC activation, so it's more effective apparently. This is based on. So we know that pulsed EMFs, when they're acting, work through this VGCC activation, and there is evidence then that they work better than the non-pulsed EMFs, and this is very important in part because every single wireless communication device communicates via pulsation, right? And so we think that these pulsed EMFs in most cases are much more biologically active and therefore much more dangerous. And yet this is exactly the kinds of exposures that we get exposed to, are the pulse ones. And so let's talk about 5G. 5G is, the whole point of 5G is to use still higher frequencies than the normal microwave frequency, because you can pulse it a lot more and therefore carry a lot more information, per second.
So it's more pulses with 5G?
I'm sorry?
It's a lot more pulses with 5G then.
It inevitably will be very, very highly pulsed, because the whole point of going to 5G is to carry lots of information.
Jeez, no one's going to be able to sleep.
Well, nobody's going to be able to do anything. I mean, I really think 5G is going to be a total disaster. Right. That is even worse than the things we've just been talking about, and quite possibly much worse than what we've been talking about.
The pulsing also interrupts melatonin production, correct?
Yes.
So that's why I said no one will be able to sleep, because they're going to put them every 500 feet.
We know the EMFs lower melatonin, and that we have a sleep disruption. there is reason to think that there must be at least one other mechanism involved in the sleep disruption. And my opinion is it's probably that you get increased levels of norepinephrine at night when you don't want it.
What's
so norepinephrine is a fight or flight hormone, and there is evidence that whereas norepinephrine levels normally are quite low at night, and that's important obviously for helping you sleep. That the EMFs raise the norepinephrine levels, and that's bad. So that's another hormonal effect that comes into this, and that's where we are. So yeah,
I wanted to say one thing on that. You were talking about all the different effects, but you haven't mentioned cardiac yet.
That's right. I haven't. That was the other thing I was going to mention.
Go ahead.
Okay, so there are cardiac effects, and let me just say, it's my opinion that the cardiac effects are direct effects of the EMFs on what are called the pacemaker cells of a particular part of the heart called the sinoatrial node. So this is the part of the heart which regulates the heartbeat. Okay, so it tells the heartbeat when to beat and how strongly to beat, and that's and so it's kind of the electrical center of the heart. And it turns out that the cells, the pacemaker cells that tell the heartbeat how fast to beat, have high levels of these VGCCs, and so I believe that they are highly sensitive to the EMFs for that reason. And the VGCCs have an important role in regulating the heartbeat. So they have important functions in this process. So so basically, what happens is that when our hearts are exposed to the EMFs, and there have been, by the way, some animal studies published back around 1970 that showed that isolated animal hearts could actually be influenced by the EMFs. So at least some of these effects are not nervous system effects; they are direct effects on the heart. And you can get tachycardia, rapid heartbeat, when you have chronic exposures. You often get bradycardia, slow heartbeat. You can get arrhythmias in both cases. Arrhythmias are often associated with sudden cardiac death. And we have, as you may know, unexplained epidemic of people dying in the middle of an athletic competition, young, apparently healthy people dying in the middle of an athletic competition of sudden cardiac death. When those, in a few cases, those people, it's been possible to save those people and to study them, as living individuals. And you often find that these people have bradycardia and that they have arrhythmias. So, so I think that there clearly is a connection with the control of the heartbeat and with the kinds of things that we know the EMFs can do to the heartbeat.
Would you associate the EMFs from Wi-Fi, these industrial, strong, high-strength industrial Wi-Fi units in the schools, with the sudden appearance of 11-year-olds having heart attacks in schools now?
I wouldn't be surprised. I didn't know about that.
Yeah, they're putting. I know in New Jersey they mandated it. I know in Canada they mandated it, and I'm not sure of the other states. But now they're putting defibrillators in schools now.
Yeah. Well, I knew that. I mean, it was. Yeah, I think so. I don't think that this would be a normal, what we normally think of as a heart attack, but it's probably the suddenness of it might be similar. But what happens? Okay, so there's one other thing that the EMFs can do, and that is they produce heart palpitations. And it's my opinion. I said before, I think all of these things are produced directly on the pacemaker cells in the sinoatrial node of the heart. It's my opinion that the heart palpitations are probably a direct effect of the big spikes that you get when you have a lot of pulsation. Some of them spike to very, very high intensities, and if you get a big spike, I believe that will produce a heart palpitation directly. I have no direct evidence on that, but it's highly plausible, and we know that when you look at the EMFs from Wi-Fi, from cell phones, from cell phone towers, and especially from smart meters.
I'm your evidence there, Dr. Paul.
Yeah,
I definitely
you get a lot of these heart palpitations.
I definitely had the heart palpitations. I thought I was due for a heart attack.
Mm-hmm.
I thought I was up in my years. I'm 67 now, mm-hmm. and I thought for sure, I'll do everything I can to try to stop it.
Mm-hmm.
But once we removed the smart meter off of our house, mainly for Raji's situation,
mm-hmm.
She had a stroke. My heart palpitation disappeared, so I know 100% that
mm-hmm.
those smart meters cause heart palpitations.
Yeah, yeah.
What about the association with congestive heart failure? Because we had a friend who
mm-hmm.
passed away from that, and he was convinced that it had to do with the smart meter and also a nearby cell phone tower.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it could be. Let me just say that. Okay, so I published a 57-page paper on heart failure, so I know a fair amount about it.
Mm-hmm.
I think that there are heart failure-like effects on the heart, and I think that they tend to be concentrated. So heart failure is somewhat heterogeneous in the sense that in some people heart failure affects certain parts of the heart, and other people you get other parts of the heart. So for instance, you can get right heart failure or left heart failure, or you can get heart failure that affects the sinoatrial node and therefore produces arrhythmias, or you can get heart failure that doesn't. And also some of the heart failure impacts the valves a lot, and some of it doesn't. So we have local effects here, and I think, and there was one study that was done in animals that showed that the EMFs produced a heart failure-like response that was specifically focused on the sinoatrial node of the heart. So it was more impacted than the other parts of the heart. Now that doesn't mean the other parts of the heart cannot be impacted by this, however. So you might get, some cases where essentially you just have a highly localized type of heart failure, and other cases where it's much broader, and that'll undoubtedly depend on what sort of exposures you've got and what kinds of what your genetics is, and probably other things that might affect the sensitivity of the heart as a whole. So, like a lot of these things in medicine, things are complicated, but on the other hand, they're relatively simple here, because almost everything goes through these DGCCs, and so we're not talking about dozens or hundreds of different targets. We're talking about one main type of target, and so that's important. Now I want to say a little bit more about the the mechanism with regard to the voltage sensor, because it turns out that there are 10 different types of VGCCs, and at least 9 of them seem to be sensitive to the EMS. We don't have any data on the 10th. It turns out there are also effects on some of the other channels, the voltage-gated sodium channels and potassium channels and chloride channels. Those effects apparently occur, but they seem to be less important in the body. So I think the main effects go through the VGCCs, but you also get some effects going through these other channels. And it turns out you also get effects in plants. And they go through, the probable target there is some channels called TPC channels, which also have a similar voltage sensor in them. So, and they also have effects in plants mainly through excessive calcium in the plant cells. So, we know a huge amount about these things. And it is absolutely bizarre to have the industry making these totally ludicrous claims that we don't know anything. I mean, it's insane. And when the FCC and the FDA, make similar statements, that's even more insane. So, here we are.
That what you were just saying, about them making the claims. Before you came on the show, I gave everybody your credentials, but I also spoke about Goebbels' statement that Hitler's right-hand man, that if you say a lie over and over and over again, it has to be a big one. It has to be a big one. People believe it. And it seems like for all these years, people have been believing, just like with tobacco, there's no problem, it's safe, and people believe it. And we have to get past that propaganda, and that's why we're so glad you're on the show.
Okay, well, good. I don't know whether you want to. Okay, we haven't gotten into 5G yet.
Yeah,
right?
let's talk about 5G.
Let's talk about 5G.
Yeah. Okay, so the plan with 5G. Okay, so the conventional microwave frequency EMFs that we're exposed to were mostly in the range of around 1 to 2.5 or so gigahertz. 5G is supposed to go from 10 gigahertz on up, so it's going to be much higher frequency. And because it's much higher frequency, it can pulse much more. So the higher the frequency in general, the more pulsations you can put into it, and therefore carry much more information. But the problem with using these very high frequencies is they don't penetrate very well. So they have to use frequency. They have to use. They have. So the plan is to have tens of millions of these 5G antennae. Something like 1 every 10 houses. So they're going to be all over the place, and then to. And so that the pulsations can penetrate into essentially every building on Earth, or at least in the countries that are dumb enough to put these things in.
When you say they don't penetrate too well, you're talking about the distance,
Right.
correct?
They don't penetrate through the materials, through solid materials.
Oh.
At a far distance, right? I mean,
Well,
if they're
they
up
don't go
close,
very far,
if
yeah,
they're up
yeah.
close, they penetrate, right?
Right. So, okay. So there's several things about this, I think, which immediately are important. One is that in general, the absorption of these things is through their interaction with electrically charged groups. I would predict that, I do predict that these what are called millimeter wave EMFs, which is what we're talking about with the 5G, will have much stronger, put much stronger forces on the voltage sensors because of their interaction with the charge groups in the voltage sensors, which is, as I said before, the voltage sensors are extraordinarily sensitive to these forces. And the second thing that I would predict is that that 5G will be extraordinarily active because of the very high levels of pulsations. And so, so the obvious thing, and I think, let me just say, this is a no-brainer. When you have these questions about 5G, what you have to do is you have to do biological safety tests. You've got to test them on, real living cells with the real voltage-gated calcium channels in them, and see what they do, and or do them in animals or do them somewhere.
They're doing that on the mass population.
Well, it's just totally insane to put this out. Now there's so that's one thing. Now there's a claim that the industry makes which needs to be considered here, and that is they claim that the 5G will not penetrate very far into the body, and they claim that it'll just work in the outer millimeter or so of our bodies. Okay, that's what they claim. And they're claiming that basically because they're claiming that the electrical effects are much lower. As you move into the body, and that may well be true, but that doesn't mean that the biological effects only occur at the very surface of the body. But so there's two things I think that have to be considered here. One is that to the extent that this claim is true, 5G will be much more active in small organisms because they have much higher surface-to-volume ratios. And that means that, babies are going to be more sensitive. It means that small mammals and birds will be more sensitive. It means that insects will be still more sensitive, including things like honeybees, which are, by the way, affected by EMFs. We know that. And I think the other thing which is true is that plants will be very highly sensitive because all plants, even large trees, have their leaves and their reproductive organs highly exposed. So they're going to be very, very sensitive. And so I think we're going to have absolute total ecological disasters as a consequence of 5G. I think that it is inevitable that will be true. Now, let's get back to the issue of can 5G penetrate, okay? The industry has been claiming for a long time that the microwave frequency EMFs can only penetrate the outer centimeter or so about 10 times more than what they claim for 5G. But we know that's not true. How do we know that? Well, we know because there are effects deep in the brain. We also know that from there was a beautiful couple of studies that were published by Professor Hessig and his colleagues in Switzerland, where they studied pregnant cattle grazing near a cell phone tower. And what they found was that the newborn calves had very high frequencies of cataracts. So what does that tell you?
How far were they from the tower?
They're grazing at various distances, but it could have been a few hundred feet or a few thousand feet. or 1,000 feet maybe, something like that. But they, I'm going to get back to that in a minute here. So what is that? So, but the point is that these developing fetuses in the cattle were buried very deeply in the mother's body. So, the industry would say, well, nothing can happen, but obviously they're wrong. And so you get cataracts.
What are they basing their claims on? What are they basing their claims on?
Well, they're basing their claims on the fact that the electrical parts of the EMS are in fact absorbed readily by the tissues of the body and by other things, and so the electrical parts do have limited penetration, and so then the question is, how then can you get effects deeply in the body? And let me just say, what I've just said to you is that these effects are going through the voltage sensor, which is an electrical response, okay? We're talking about electrical, it's the voltage sensor is something that detects electrical changes. So how can that work? And what I think is happening is the following, that while the electrical parts of EMS are relatively quickly absorbed, the magnetic parts are highly penetrating. And when they penetrate deeply into the body, what they do is they put these forces on these ions that are dissolved in the water in the body, and move them. Okay, and when you put these forces on these charged groups, and you have astronomical number of charges, you're just putting a weak force on each of them. What's going to happen? What you do is you regenerate the electrical parts of the EMF, same frequency, same pulsations, just lower intensity. But the point is, the lower intensity isn't necessarily important when you have a voltage sensor that's so extraordinarily sensitive to these EMFs. So I think what's happening here is exactly that. We do get these cataracts forming. We're going to get a lot of other things happening. And I think exactly the same thing's going to happen with 5G. It's going to be the magnetic parts that basically regenerate the electrical parts in the body, and they will then produce effects.
Don't you think 5G is going to speed up the latency period too?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear what you said.
Don't you think 5G is going to speed up the latency period, the cumulative effect?
Yeah, I think it's going to affect everything, and I mean it's going to have a lot of. It may also have some selective things that are somewhat different from what we see with the microwave frequency EMS. So the best evidence on from what we have on millimeter waves is they do produce similar effects to what you see with microwaves. But as I said, those studies have been done without any pulsations in them, so they don't really tell us how bad 5G is going to be. But I think that this thing is I do think there may be, however, some things that may be much worse with 5G. And let me just mention some of them. When you look at the four, so in the eye, you've got the aqueous humor and the vitreous humor. So you've got fairly large bodies of water sort of in there. So in terms of regenerating the electrical parts of the EMFs, those may be quite active in doing so. And then what happens is they're going to impact the important parts of the eye, the retina and the cornea and the lens, etc. So, and in so doing, if you look at the 4 major types of blindness, which include cataracts, which of course are treatable, but also detached retinas, which are more difficult to treat, and glaucoma and macular degeneration. All of them involve what we call downstream effects of the excess of calcium in the cell, and so I think it's quite possible we may have a gigantic epidemic of blindness coming in from 5G. Again, do I know that to be the case? No, I don't. But the only way to test that sort of thing is to do biological safety testing. To put out tens of millions of these without doing a single biological safety test is totally insane. That's. I think there may be other effects that may occur to a much greater extent from 5G than we've seen from the microwave frequency EMS. I think one of them may be kidney effects. I haven't talked about kidney effects, but there are kidney effects, again in the kidney you've got regions where there's a lot of aqueous stuff, right, where you're making urine, and so I think it's quite possible that 5G will have major impacts on the kidney, and we may have a gigantic epidemic of kidney failure.
And a lot of people put their smartphones in their back pockets, very close to the kidneys.
Well, yeah, and some people put their smartphones in their front pocket near their hearts.
Right.
And I know of people who've developed cardiac effects when they've done that. So, yeah, it's.
I know people who've had tumors on the side of their head where they had the cell phone, and they continue after they had the surgery. I've seen them in the past week with a cell phone slapped right against their head talking. I mean,
it's like tobacco.
What are we going to do with these people?
Well, yeah.
It's a choice. It's a choice.
It's crazy.
I just want to go back to the latency period again, because we've talked about it being 5 to 10 years, and I know that that's what's out there in mainstream, and I've said it too.
We're talking about cancer now.
Not just cancer, but any effect from EMFs, basically.
No, EMF can produce instantaneous effects.
Right. And that's what I was going to say, because they, especially with 5G, since 5G was the last topic we were on, in New York, they decided to roll out 5G on Long Island, for example, and all kinds of videos came out on YouTube of people who had the posts installed in their front yard with a mini cell 5G, and they're already talking about how sick everyone's getting there. I mean, that's a very long, rather thin island, and they plastered it.
Can you give me some information on that? I mean, can I get some?
I'll send you some links.
Okay, please do.
And when you look in your email, my email is pilgrimpeace@gmail. So, because I have some things I want to send you too, basically about the twitching that we were talking about.
Yeah, okay. Mm-hmm.
And I'll send you about that too. So we have some emails to send you.
And my email is rajinevan7@gmail.
Okay.
So,
well, I've heard some things going on in New York, and I haven't been able to get any hard information on them. So if we have if there is hard information, I would like to know that, and sooner the better.
And obviously it's true of the smart meters as well, because I always tell people, with myself personally, I had a lot of exposure to computers and Wi-Fi, all sorts of things, because I worked in corporate offices most of my life, and it wasn't until I was in a home where there was a smart meter about 6 feet from my head every night. That's when I got sick, and It definitely did
And
quite a
I've
bit
heard
of
that
nerve
from a lot of
damage.
people.
And I didn't know until I listened to you this evening that that was an absolute fact. But when I started to heal myself after I had the mini stroke, the one thing that I determined what was wrong with my body was excessive amounts of nerve damage, and that's what I treated first.
Yeah.
And you never really get back to 100%. Then you become one of those, they love to use the word sensitive, which I don't like.
Well, anyway, I don't know. I mean, I think EHS is a genuine phenomenon, and it's something that's, of course, becoming more and more common.
I don't think it's 5% of the population either, like they say.
No, I don't think it is either. I think it's probably, at this point, probably 30 to 50%.
That's what I figured. That's what I figured
something
too.
like
Yep.
that.
Exactly.
But the thing is that we have to be careful because the sensitivity levels vary tremendously, and so it's important for people to know that you're not talking about something where one sensitive person is the same as another. They're not. We have a lot of differences, and we have a lot of differences both in terms of average sensitivity and also in terms of what parts of the body are most impacted by it.
Right.
And it's a complex phenomenon, and it has a lot of and a lot of the sensitivity is local, so that you can have one part of the body being sensitive and other parts less sensitive or perhaps normal. So anyway, yeah.
So do you feel like there's a chance that we can stop 5G from being rolled out, or what's your feeling about that?
Well, I wish I knew the answer to that. I don't know. I think that it is probably the case that the only way we can stop 5G is based on the observations of people who are already being impacted by it. In other words, some of us will be sacrificed, but at least if that sacrifice can lead to to shutting this thing down, then maybe we have some hope for the society as a whole. I think this whole thing is just insane. It's just absolutely insane.
On that note, Dr. Paul.
Yeah.
I have put out an email to our legislators and elected representatives in our area that if they had any important questions that they would like to ask you, to please call in at 9 o'clock. So we'll continue with our discussion here, and any of those. Call back on that one. Hold on.
Yeah. Yeah. Hold on a second. Let me. I need to write this down. Okay. 679. What is it? Okay. 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 Great. I'll do that right away. Yep. Yep. Got it.
Okay, and this is, we had to straighten something out there a little bit with communications, and this is WIOF-LP Woodstock 104 at 104.1 FM. The program is The the Woodstock Truth Squad with Steve Romine. And we also have Raji Nevin here in the studio. And on the phone is Dr. Martin Paul, expert worldwide on 5G and various other subjects.
Okay, is that you, Dr. Paul?
Hold on. Okay, let me grab you.
Okay, is that you, Dr. Paul?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks for doing that. So anybody out there who is a elected representative or legislator or town board member, please call in on 679-9104. 679-9104. If you would like to ask Dr. Paul any questions concerning 5G and anything you want to ask him about this issue, this is a golden opportunity for everybody out there who is an elected representative to call in. We'll take callers that are not elected representatives a little later, but right now we only want elected representatives to call in and speak with Dr. Paul. So the line is open if anybody's out there. Go ahead, Dr. Paul. What did you want to continue to talk about?
I'm not sure.
Oh. So how about Wi-Fi in the schools? Where we have, to me, this is a huge issue in our community and everybody's community.
Yeah.
That these kids are being exposed to industrial strength transmitters. 6 hours a day, 5 days a week for their whole school life and into college. I mean, this with no concern for the children, except, of course, they think they're helping them academically, but they're really not, because, as you know, it's affecting their cognitive abilities. What can you tell us about this?
Okay, so let me just say, I just recently published a paper on Wi-Fi.
I read it.
And then there was another paper that was published that found very similar effects to the ones that I did, also, on Wi-Fi specifically. And so what I found, and so this is based on, this is actually quite, let me just say, this is kind of interesting because, one of the things that we haven't talked about is the fact that basically the funding for research in these areas was cut off starting in 1986 in at least 3 or 4 different steps until 1999, when the last little bit of funding that was left at that point was cut off as well. And what that means is that none of the studies on Wi-Fi have been done in the U.S. None of the studies on exposure to cell phone tower radiation have been done in the U.S. There's only a single study on genuine cell phone radiation being done in the U.S. All the others, and there are over 50 of them, were done elsewhere. So we are absolutely nowhere in terms of the science, in terms of either the experimental science or the epidemiology of what's going on here. And it's really...
That's bizarre.
Absolutely horrendous that the U.S. government would be so active in pushing this technology while being almost completely inactive in trying to determine what the biological effects are. And I have to say, as a U.S. scientist, it's just an outrage. I mean, we take great pride in our science, but we are nowhere in this, basically, because the science has been corrupted. And fortunately, there is good work that's going on elsewhere, and actually the two. So all the work that's done on genuine Wi-Fi has been done elsewhere, and the two most active research groups actually are both in Turkey. But there's also some good work that's been coming from other countries. So we are in a really bizarre situation. I mean, by the criterion of if we use this as the criterion for the corruption of science, we are the most corrupt country on earth.
Wow.
And I realize that there are other criteria that one can use for that, but just simply being able to say that is just bizarre beyond belief.
Well, that's true, because we tried to present science and with dozens of different studies, documentation, and we also proposed that we bring experts in via Skype or in person to a local school here. We had it lined up. We were ready to go. And out of the blue, they said, we're disbanding this. It's no longer going to happen. When we got close to actually showing them the science. So it makes you wonder, why would that be, other than things like perhaps someone's getting paid off? Because why would that be? They say they care about the children. These are administrative people and teachers were on these panels, and they didn't want to know about the science. We had the science to give to them.
Yeah.
And they didn't want to know. In fact, they cut us off. And that's not what's happening in other countries. They're paying attention. They're taking Wi-Fi out of schools. They're taking Wi-Fi out of the libraries. So why would that be that just in the U.S. they're determined not to even allow people to look at the science?
The other thing that's interesting about the U.S., and here I think this is generally true, but is that the companies that install Wi-Fi require that the school boards or whatever other organizations are having the Wi-Fi put in assume the liability, and they're assuming liability when you cannot get insurance to cover the liability, because the insurance companies are too smart to insure for liability on these things, except with very, very high rates that nobody can afford. So, that's, so you have the insurance companies that, of course, make their money off of assessing risk, saying there's a high level of risk here. And then you have the telecommunications industry saying, oh, no, there's no risk at all. So it's the more you look at this, the crazier it gets.
Right.
It's just okay. So let's talk a little bit about Wi-Fi in the schools. One of the things I think that's important is that there is a fair amount of evidence of different types that young people are much more sensitive to EMFs than are adults, and there appear to be at least 3 or 4 different mechanisms that are involved there. And one is that we talked about before, the surface to volume ratios of young children is much higher, and so their tissues are more exposed, so they're going to have bigger effects for that reason. And then there's another reason, and that is that stem cells are much more sensitive to the EMFs than are non-stem cells, and of course, the younger you are, the more stem cells you've got, per unit volume. So fetuses have the highest amount of stem cells, and then young babies and so forth, until and so adults have the lowest level. So that's another reason why young people are more sensitive. And again, everything I say, of course, the industry will deny. I guarantee it.
With no science to back it up either.
Well, exactly, yeah. But there's a third thing, and that is that the developing brain seems to be much more sensitive than the adult brain, and we already talked about some of the reasons why that's true. So that's another factor.
What about
And
the
then,
thinner skulls? Some people say that the skulls are thinner, and that makes a
well, the
difference.
skulls are thinner. That's right. Though they are thinner, and so obviously, yeah. So the exposure of the brain is going to be higher.
Right.
But then there are issues. I talked about the fact that when you regenerate the electrical parts from the magnetic parts, it occurs in the aqueous regions, and it turns out that young tissues have a lot more sort of water content than older tissues. So that's another reason why young people are likely to be more sensitive. So all of those things argue that we shouldn't have Wi-Fi in schools, the thing about Wi-Fi in schools is so stupid. You can access the internet without Wi-Fi. You just do it wired, and yeah, it's a little less convenient, but so what?
Exactly.
Losing your brain function, losing your reproductive function, getting cancer, having your hearts, cause you to die or at least undergo horrible stuff. And it goes on and on. It's destroying your hormone function, destroying the DNA of your cells. I mean, where's the common sense in this? I mean, it's crazy.
And when we approached the school system, it was only for the elementary school, and they already had everything in place to hardwire. It wouldn't have been that difficult, and it wouldn't have been that costly.
No.
And still, when we brought up the science,
yeah,
they
rolled
turned
their
it
eyes.
off.
They rolled their eyes.
They turned it off.
Well, they can be sued.
Yeah.
They can be sued personally
we served them a notice of liability. Each one of those people, we served them notices of liability.
We handed them 700 pages of documents and research.
Yeah.
And I put it in front of every board on the school board at a school board meeting. And Raji read the letter that went with it.
The notice of
and
liability.
we told them that we gave them a notice of liability. They are now liable, and they're committing willful blindness
Personally.
by ignoring this information, and that they can be held for child negligence.
Yeah.
So, and that's on record. That was filmed.
Felicia would like to say something.
Do you want to repeat the phone number again, or I'll repeat it?
Yeah. By the way, since no legislators are calling in, we'll start to take calls from the public, and that is 679-9104. 679-9104. If anybody wants to call in and ask Dr. Paul a question on this issue. And something I want to say to you, Dr. Paul, is see if I can grab it, that...
Too much Wi-Fi.
No, okay. So with the Wi-Fi, with the iPads in the classes, now the kids don't have paper; they all have iPads. And we all know that anybody who's looked knows that the FCC guidelines are ridiculous and have no application to the situation, but yet they say. An individual iPad, after 6 minutes of exposure, if it doesn't produce any heat, it's safe. But what they haven't figured is if you have a kid surrounded by 30 other kids with iPads that are two-way communicators, each kid is being exposed to multiple iPads, and this is a major harm in and of itself.
No, that's right. Yeah. Well, but the point is the heating thing is complete and utter nonsense, and it ought to be stated that every time that the FCC comes up, the point is that we know that the FCC guidelines are ridiculous. They have no science behind them whatsoever.
They're ludicrous.
And so that has to be said right up front, and let me just say, I gave a talk to three people at the FCC in September 2016, and I wrote a more or less contemporaneous account of what I presented there, from my PowerPoint presentation. and it was quite interesting, actually. I mean, I thought they were going to attack me, but they didn't. They asked some questions, and I answered them, and that was.
We have a caller wants to ask you a question, Dr.
Yeah.
Paul.
Hi, Dr. Paul.
Yes.
I recently read a book called The Zapping of America by Paul Broder. You may be familiar with that book. In any case, the author claimed that the radiation levels on naval vessels in the Pacific and other places was so high that in order for and this is just to meet the FCC compliance, that sailors had to actually be about 300 feet away from the ship. So my question to you is, there's been quite a bit of mishaps, shall we say, out in the Pacific, lack of seamanship and fatigue and so on.
Yeah.
Would you care to comment on that? Do you think that that's as a result of the radiation levels accumulating in the bodies of the sailors out there?
Well, I've been thinking that may be the case, but I wasn't familiar with this book, so I'm very interested in what you had to say about it. I think that we have a whole series of peculiar things that are going on that may well be produced by the EMF effects on people's brains, and I think that the naval pilots and the things that have happened is probably one example of that. Can you give me the book again?
Yeah, it's called The Zapping of America. It's by
Zapping of America.
Yeah, by Paul Broder. It was written in 1976.
So this is quite an old book, then.
It is. The guy was a writer for the New Yorker.
But so how long have the naval vessel EMF's been that high, though?
Well, he must be, since the Second World War, because he goes right back. He starts his studies back in the Second World War, and then he moves up. And
well, I guess what I'm wondering is whether the types of exposures may have changed, and that's why we have the recent problems.
Yeah, maybe because it's more intense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know, but we have that. We've had a number of electric train crashes where they were going 2 to 3 times the speeds that they were supposed to go. And these electric engines, you can have very high EMFs there. I think there are problems in police cars where you have a lot of exposures, quite high level exposures, and that may be important. I think that it's quite possible that the two airline crashes that were deliberately caused, the German wings crash in the Alps and the Malaysia Airlines crash that went the wrong way into the Indian Ocean. That those may have been caused by the brain effects on the pilots.
Wow.
Now, I mean, all of that can be viewed as speculation, but the point is we know that you get neuropsychiatric effects. We know that among those you get you do get depression. That's one of the effects that occurs, and and there is at least some reason to think that there's a loss of empathy as well, which is a very complex neurological function. And, so if you've got people, and I wonder also about the people that go and join ISIS. I mean, and the mass shootings. These are mostly things that are both examples of suicide and mass homicide simultaneous.
Right. There was that. I mean, this is a far out thing, but there was that shooter in Maryland that he had EMF inscribed in his rifle stock. So I don't know. He claimed that voices were speaking to him. So I don't know if there's channels out there that are just subliminally being, radio channels going on.
I think the thing that strikes me is just that there are, there's so much information on these things that's out there. And while while we have some things that are clear and present and existential threats, and I definitely include the neurological, neuropsychiatric, and the reproductive effects, and the effects on our genomic DNA. I think all three of those are of that sort. Even the other things, the many other things that we've talked about here, are major risks. Are major risks. Whether they're existential or not, is in some cases is not obvious, but they are major risks. And how we can take these risks without serious consideration is absolutely is absolutely bizarre. And I think the question one wonders about is whether we've already destroyed our collective brain functions to the point where we can't respond effectively to this.
I want to interject something. I want to interject something there, Dr. Paul.
Yeah.
First of all, this is Weston Blealock. He's a close collaborator with us on fighting the good fight here on this issue that you're speaking to. And also, do you know about the document, the declassified document that states that they said, and the title of the document was something about the development of microwaves in the Eurasian countries. Have you heard about that document?
No, I have not.
I'll send it to you. And in it, it's our military intelligence saying that if we were to adopt the strict standards of the East in the more developed countries, being us, it would affect our military operations and industrial output. That's what they said.
When was this written?
In the 70s.
Okay, I do know that document.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
And actually, that's picked up a little bit in this Broder book, because they said that if they had strict compliance, the military would not be able to afford the military bases, because the setbacks into the civilian population would be such that they did, the cities had already grown up around the military bases. It was too late. So they had to deliberately keep the standards so high.
Yeah, this was the Defense Intelligence Agency,
yes,
wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Yes, I do know that document.
All right, well, that's my question. I thoroughly enjoyed listening to you, Dr. Paul, and I wish you would return back to the 5G. If you have anything more on that, I'd like to hear about it.
Okay.
But I don't want to influence Steve's show.
No. Well, that's a good influence. We want to hear more about 5G too.
Yeah. All right. So
it's my opinion that we're 5G could have almost instantaneous effects, disastrous effects. I don't know how fast it's going to go, but I think with the exposures that we currently have, which of course have increased tremendously over what we had even 10 years ago, or maybe even 5 years ago, that we have very little time anyway to turn this thing around. I think something like 5 years is probably reasonable, but
Wow.
we can hope that I'm wrong, but it could be even worse than that.
Wow.
And as I've
Especially
already
since-
said, if you think that our collective brain function's already deteriorated to the point where we can't deal with it, then we're gone. Now, I realize that when I say things like that, I sound like one of these cartoon figures, waving a sign saying, the end is coming, repent. And I know it sounds totally ludicrous, but it seems to me very clear. That's where the science is pointing.
Well,
And you just cannot, I am not going to downpedal this thing because with the view that, well, maybe people will believe something that's, about something less. I think you have to be realistic about the threats that you're facing in order to deal with them.
Exactly.
And so I don't think that, and some people have said, you've got to downpedal it, but it's. And there are lots of these things that we can still do much more safely than we're doing them now. I use the internet all the time, and because I have to use it, but everything's wired, and
Right.
even in my computer, I even use a wired mouse and a wired keyboard, and my printers are wired.
Do you have a translucent screen on your monitor?
No, but I do have some shielding over it.
Oh, okay. Because I have a translucent screen that's grounded
Oh, okay.
over my computer screen,
We're hardwired
and we're
too.
hardwired.
Okay. Yeah.
I don't think you sound like a cartoon character at all. I think there's thousands and thousands and thousands of people on the same page you are. And I think that those people are coming forward now with the more science that's coming out. So I don't think what you're saying is even close to being crazy. I think it's very realistic.
The Ramazzini report certainly supports what you're saying, and so does the NTP with the sterility in the rats.
Yeah.
And also with the legislation, the government getting involved where they're trying to put the power in the hands of the federal government, that's really what the telecom industry wants, so that they can just slap it out quickly without getting any consent from anyone and without people knowing it, because what's happening now is it's like a race. We're trying to inform people as fast as possible with education, and in the meantime, the telecom industry's practically screaming, let's get 5G out there, let's get 5G out there.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Well.
Thanks,
I
Weston.
don't know,
I have one more question.
Go ahead.
Now, the self-driving cars, apparently there's all of these different, there's sonar on the front, and there's different, maybe, I don't know how many different antenna on these cars. If you're an ordinary civilian standing by the side of the road and one of these vehicles goes by, about how much of a dose would a person get?
I don't know.
Oh, okay.
I'm concerned about radar in this.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Okay.
And of course, even without self-driving, we still have things like things that detect cars that are nearby and so forth, that to prevent side crashes and things of this sort.
And also Bluetooth, and a lot of cars now are coming equipped, they advertise them as your own local Wi-Fi hotspot.
Yeah, right. Just what we need. Yeah.
And GPSs.
I'm sorry?
And GPSs as well. I mean, new cars are pretty toxic.
Yeah. Well, that's what I am told by my friends who are, EHS, is that there are lots of cars that they cannot tolerate.
Exactly.
Wow.
Anyway.
Well, thank you very much. I'll beg off now. Thank you.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Weston.
Thanks,
Right,
Weston.
right. Bye-bye.
Okay.
Give out the phone number.
Okay, the line is open. The line is open. If anybody wants to call in, and 679-9104, Dr. Paul is with us, and please call in.
And that's 679-9104, 679-9104 in the 845 area code.
So you were talking about 5G, and it's you know, what about the fact that it's the same frequencies in the 5G that's being used in these crowd control weapons? I mean, that's concerning to me that they want to put these every 500 feet, and
Well, it'd be more than that.
yeah. Oh, is it? Do you know? Do
Yeah.
you know what the actual figure is? Because I keep
Well, they
hearing.
talked about putting them every 10 houses or so.
Oh, okay. So every 10 houses, you got this device with a lithium battery power supply that can explode if there's a fire, and then you have these frequencies that are used by the police and the military in crowd control that makes people's skin feels like it's on fire.
Yeah. Well, it's, you know, the I haven't really looked into these, but my understanding is that you're right about that, and that again, it's because you get a tremendous amount of absorption in the outer parts of the body. But you know, they've got some millimeter wave stuff that they're using for airport screening too, and that's apparently caused problems. So I don't know. You know, it's just everything seems to be. It's so insane, and it's just crazy. And we know that these things are unsafe, and we know that you know. So why in the hell are we doing all of this?
And you mentioned it in, I believe, your 90-page document about the Naval Medical Research Institute. And I mean, how many citations did they give?
They gave about 2,300, but they were not all non-thermal effects.
Right.
So I think there were probably about 1,000 of them that were that were clearly non-thermal effects.
The demonstrated non-thermal effects.
Yeah, but there's I mean, there are over 10,000 studies, I think, that have published that are, you know, show that there are effects that the industry claims don't exist. And there are, you know, in the reviews that I listed for these eight different effects, there were a total of 79 reviews, and each of them, you know, reviewed a substantial literature. So we're talking about, you know, a large literature about these things. And, you know, my question for organizations like the FCC and the FDA that make statements of, you know, basically, well, we don't know anything, or, you know, the statements they make typically are of the following sort. They say that, well, there have been a few studies that have shown effects, and then they say, but it hasn't been possible to reproduce them, but we're still looking.
Right.
That's what they say. And they give no evidence whatsoever on any of those things. Right. And so my question is, taking each of these effects, reproductive effects, the neurological, neuropsychiatric effects, in each of these, you know, the hormonal effects, the oxidative stress effects, the effects on the DNA of the cells, et cetera, document each of those. You know, they need to document each of those for each of those effects. And they need to show why each of these 79 different reviews that each show there's a body of literature for, you know, for one or more different effects. Why each of those 79 published, you know, findings are wrong. And you know, and so, you know, so they need to be challenged in a whole series of venues on exactly those points. Because otherwise, this is just all crap. And let me just say, in my 90-page document, you know, I mean, one of the things that I showed was that you know, for instance, the FDA back in I forget it was about 1994, I think it was, put out a statement, on cancer after they had already had an in-house document showing that there was a strong argument that EMFs do cause cancer. So they had that information from an in-house document. Now, what I showed in my 90-page document were that there were also reviews, published reviews, that showed the same thing back at that time. So it wasn't that the information was somehow novel, but that was produced in the FDA, but that the FDA knew about it and then opted to ignore it and put out a statement saying there really wasn't any evidence.
And kept repeating the lie.
Exactly.
I have a question about the excessive calcium in the cells.
Yes.
I'm just curious if you know, is there anything that you can take into the body, such as something herbal, that would help to block some of that calcium from going into the cells? In other words, is there some way to mitigate it?
Yeah. I think there are some things, but let me just say, first of all, I'm a PhD, not an MD.
Yeah.
Nothing I say should be viewed as medical advice.
Okay.
And so I want to make that clear.
Sure.
I think there are some things that may be helpful. One of them are magnesium supplements.
Yeah, that's what I was
Right.
thinking of.
That's good.
However, my view of magnesium supplements is somewhat different from what some other people have argued. I think that magnesium is mainly useful because so many of us are magnesium deficient.
Right.
We have very low levels of magnesium in our soils and because they've been depleted in our foods, particularly processed foods. And so almost everyone has a magnesium deficiency. And when you have a magnesium deficiency, one of the things that happens is you actually make more of the VGCCs. So I think that magnesium is something that probably we should all be taking anyway, and that's something that that's useful here. I think zinc may be useful as well, but less so, because there is a regulatory site, a metal-binding regulatory site on the VGCCs, which binds zinc, and zinc may be useful in at least producing a modest lowering of activity.
Does the zinc pull it out of the system, or how does it work?
It acts as it binds directly to the VGCCs
It
and
absorbs
it changes
it.
their activity. But within the normal physiological range, that's a modest effect, but it may be useful. The other thing which I think is important is a regulatory system which is called NRF2, NRF number 2. And I published a paper on that in PubMed, which you can access by just putting in NRF2 and my name, Martin Pall, Pall, into the PubMed database, and you can pull it out. And it doesn't cost anything, so you can click on it and get it full text. NRF2 is an amazing regulatory system, and it lowers a lot of the effects of excessive calcium in the cells. And and there are a whole bunch of them, including the oxidative stress things and the inflammation, which we haven't talked about, that are produced by it, and you lower those things by raising NRF2. It turns out that NRF2 is a thing that you make in the cells of your body. It's a transcription factor that controls a lot of different genes, and it improves it improves oxidative stress responses, and it lowers inflammation, and it excessive calcium in the cell.
So
So,
Nerf 2 you can purchase as a
I'm
pill?
sorry?
Can you purchase
Well, you
it?
can't purchase it. What you can do is you can, there are a lot of nutritional factors that raise NRF2 that are discussed in that paper.
Okay.
And there are a lot of other health promoting factors that raise NRF2. And they're also discussed in that paper, and there are also some that I didn't discuss in there. But that'll give you some some insight into how you can actually raise NRF2 in your body, and that may be a quite a useful approach. So it's I'm not claiming any of these things are magic bullets, but at this point we need all the help we can get.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned magnesium, and I may have said this to you before, but there's a woman whose name is Dr. Carolyn Dean, and she wrote a book called The Magnesium Miracle, and she said in the book, and I've heard her repeat it, that if everyone were to raise their magnesium levels to where they're supposed to be, because everyone's so deficient, that it would put the pharmaceutical companies out of business. So obviously we all need magnesium, and her particular type of magnesium that she sells is liquid, and it goes in at a cellular level, so it's very different from other types of magnesium.
Well, I can't comment on that. I don't know. But
I have some questions for you, too.
Sure.
First
I'm going to have to ring off pretty soon.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just wanted to, one thing I wanted to say, if you could make a comment to our planning board, as if though they were sitting here, about their reviewing an application for 5G, and you were there, what would you tell them?
I think what I would tell them is that it is absolutely insane to put out all of these antennae, which we have good reason to think will be very dangerous, without a single biological safety test. It is this is the stupidest thing that, as far as I can tell, has ever been done in the history of the world. And if they're complicit in this, then they have responsibilities. I mean, I think one always has to be careful about comparing things with what went on during the Nazi era. But in a lot of ways, this is worse.
Yeah.
And
I just want to mention that this is coming from, what you're saying is coming from one who speaks internationally around the world on these issues. You've written peer-reviewed studies. You're a PhD from Caltech, and you're well-known expert in this field. And you're telling our planning board it's insane to even consider it. Am I correct?
Yes, you are correct.
Okay, that's good. And the other thing is, I have several.
I think, one other thing. I think, someone has said to me that, we went through the issues of responsibility in situations that have huge impacts in the Nuremberg trials and the Nuremberg laws. We need to pay very close attention to those.
And in saying that, would you go as far as to say that what we're doing is committing the human race to a mass experiment with microwave irradiation and millimeter radiation?
I think it's worse than that.
Okay.
I think we're approaching mass suicide.
Wow.
I mean, that's look, it's we what is eminently plausible is that, and let me say, okay, well, I guess there's there's a couple of important things I didn't talk about. I have to say them quickly because I really have to run on.
Go ahead.
These things are, a lot of these things are cumulative, and they become irreversible. And that means basically that, when we're exposed to these EMFs and we have our brain function deteriorating, it's going to get worse and worse and worse with the same level of exposure that we have now. If we have increasing levels, then obviously we can't really predict how bad it's going to be, but it's going to be really horrible. And so, this is insanity. It's absolute insanity. It's just crazy. And we have, good, strong evidence that I talk about in that 90-page document that these things are cumulative and they become irreversible. You can't ignore this stuff. And if you ignore this stuff, then you're complicit in impacts on tens of millions of people at a minimum. It's crazy. This is insane, and this is not time for politics as usual.
Exactly.
So that's my opinion, and that's what I would tell. Are you recording all this stuff?
Yes. I'll send
so
you.
Are you going to put this on the internet so people can access it?
I'm going to put it on a link, and I'll put it on my website, and I'll send it to you also.
Okay, good. Thank you.
And I just want to thank you so much for coming on the show and spending all the time you did and being patient with us. Thank you very, very much. Maybe in the future you can come back.
Well, maybe. I don't know.
I know you're so busy. So busy. But
okay.
We definitely would hope. What's happened is we're waiting for the Sprint T-Mobile, one company now. They say they're going to resubmit an application.
Okay. I'm sorry. I got to run off.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Okay.
We'll talk to you later. Good night.
Sure. Okay. And send me those things. Okay, please.
I will.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Look up Dr. Martin Paul's peer-reviewed studies. If you DuckDuckGo, Martin Paul electromagnetic, and all his studies will come up. Thanks for tuning in. Have a good night.
And to reiterate, Woodstock 104 and Birds of a Feather Media Limited and any of its officers neither endorse nor disendorse any candidate for any office.